Please let us stay. I will serve you, said girl. And rancher took her, and Mary's feet burned with every step as she walked down the dusty road. Her clothes were tattered, her hair messy, and her face streaked with dirt and tears. It felt like the world had closed in on her, leaving her with nothing but the endless horizon ahead. She had always dreamed of a different life, a life full of promise, love, and hope. But now, after the sudden deaths of her parents, all that was left was emptiness. The small town she had grown up in had become a place filled with painful memories, and there was no longer a home to return to. Her hands shook as she wiped away a tear, trying to hold on to what little strength she had left. Her younger brother Tommy walked beside her, quiet and lost in his own thoughts. He was only 12, but his eyes were already filled with the kind of sadness that came with hardship. Mary tried to smile at him, but it was hard. What could she possibly say to reassure him when she felt just as lost as he did? They had nowhere to go, no family, no friends to turn to. The world had cast them aside, and it was all she could do to keep moving forward. But forward to where? The question haunted her every step. Then, just as the sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden glow over the landscape, she saw something in the distance. An old, worn-down ranch house. The sight of it brought a glimmer of hope. Maybe they could find refuge there. Maybe this rancher would take pity on them. She didn't know what else to do. Breath. Mary didn't even hesitate before walking toward the gate. The old wooden fence creaked as she pushed it open, and she felt her heart race. She had never done anything like this before. She had always been proud, always believed she could handle anything. But now, pride didn't matter. She needed help. As she reached the front porch, she paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. She didn't want to appear weak, but she didn't know how else to ask for help. She glanced at Tommy, who was standing behind her, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "Stay close," she whispered to him. With a shaky hand, she knocked on the door. For a long moment, there was no answer. She started to wonder if maybe no one was home, or if they were too afraid to let strangers in. Just as she was about to turn away, the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall and weathered from years of hard work under the sun. His clothes were simple but sturdy, his boots worn down from walking the land, and his face was lined with the marks of someone who had seen much but said little. His eyes were sharp, observing her with quiet curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. Mary hesitated. What could she possibly say? She had to ask for help, but she didn't want to come across as desperate. Breath. She didn't want to burden him, but she had no choice. "Please, sir," she started, her voice trembling. "I know this might be a lot to ask, but could you let us stay here for a while? My brother and I have nowhere to go. I'll do anything to help around here. Clean, cook, take care of the animals, anything. I just don't know where else to turn." The rancher stared at her for a long moment, and for a second she feared he would turn her away. His expression was unreadable, and Mary couldn't help but feel like he was sizing her up, judging her worth.
"I understand it's a lot to ask," Mary continued, her heart pounding in her chest.
"But we have nothing left. We'll leave as soon as we can."
"We won't be a burden, I swear." The rancher's gaze softened, and after what felt like an eternity, he finally stepped aside, allowing her to enter. "All right," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You can stay for a while, but you'll work just like anyone else around here." Relief washed over her in a wave, and she nearly collapsed with the weight of it. She hadn't realized how heavy the burden had been until it was finally lifted. She looked down at Tommy, and for the first time in days, she saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Thank you," Mary whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The rancher nodded, his face still hard but now with a hint of something warmer beneath it.
Come on in then. I'll show you where you'll stay. As Mary stepped over the threshold, she felt an odd sense of gratitude.
This place, this ranch, wasn't much. The house was old and weathered, and the land stretched out in all directions, barren in some places and full of life in others. But it was a home. For now, it was enough. The first few days on the ranch were hard, but Mary was determined to make herself useful. She and Tommy had been shown to a small guest cabin, little more than a room with a bed and a table. It was simple, but it was a roof over their heads, and that was more than they had hoped for. Every morning, as the sun rose and the sky turned from a soft purple to a bright blue, Mary set to work. She woke early, knowing there was much to be done if she wanted to earn her place on the ranch. The rancher, whose name she had learned was Samuel, was a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than any words could. Worked tirelessly, feeding the animals, tending to the crops, and repairing fences. It seemed like there was always something to do, and Mary, though exhausted by the end of the day, found herself taking pride in the work. There was a satisfaction in knowing that her hands, calloused and sore, were contributing to something worthwhile. Tommy, though young, was eager to help as well. He spent his days cleaning the barn, feeding the chickens, and even learning to milk the cows under Samuel's watchful eye. Samuel wasn't a man to give praise easily, but when he saw Tommy carefully carrying a bucket of milk to the kitchen, he nodded in approval. Mary worked alongside him, learning quickly how to care for the horses, how to gather eggs from the chickens, and how to patch up the barn roof when the wind had torn a hole in it. She was no stranger to hard work. She had grown up helping her parents with their farm, but Samuel's ranch was different. It was bigger, more demanding, and the land stretched out endlessly before her, a constant reminder that there was always something to do. But as the days turned into weeks, Mary began to notice more than just the work. Samuel, though he was a quiet man, had a presence that couldn't be ignored. He moved with a purpose, his every step measured and deliberate. His hands, strong from years of labor, were gentle when they touched the animals, guiding them with a quiet confidence. His weathered face, lined with the marks of time, held a deep sadness that Mary could not quite place, but it made her wonder what kind of man he had been before the ranch, before the years of solitude. She caught glimpses of him when he wasn't working, sitting on the porch, staring off into the distance, his mind far away. At times he seemed lost in thought, as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. Mary wanted to ask him about it, wanted to know more about the man who had taken them in, but she didn't know how. She couldn't bring herself to be that forward, especially when she had nothing to offer in return. She wasn't sure he would want to talk about his past. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting a golden light over the ranch, Mary found herself on the porch cleaning the small kitchen table. She was alone, with Tommy inside playing a game, when she saw Samuel coming from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. His expression was tired, and his shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. He didn't notice her at first, but when he did, he gave a small nod and walked over to the porch steps. "Evening," he said, his voice low but warm. "Evening," Mary replied, forcing a smile. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Then Samuel spoke again, his words slow, deliberate. "Thank you for all your help. You've been doing well around here." Mary's heart fluttered at the unexpected compliment. It wasn't much, but it meant something. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge her efforts, let alone praise them. "I'm just doing what I can. It's not much, but it's something," she said quietly, her hand still wiping the table. She didn't know what else to say. Samuel was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hands resting on his knees. I didn't expect company, he muttered, more to himself than to Mary.
But you and Tommy?
You're good people. You're not causing trouble. Breaths. It's been a long time since I've had anyone around here.
Mary wasn't sure how to respond to that.
She didn't want to push too much, but she felt the need to say something, to let him know she understood. It's hard, isn't it? Living out here by yourself. Samuel glanced at her, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment before he nodded.
It can be. But it's better than other things. Mary didn't press him for more.
She knew when to stay silent. There were moments when it felt like Samuel wanted to say more, but his words never came. The silence stretched between them, comfortable in its own way, until finally, Samuel stood up and stretched his back. "I'll be inside soon enough," he said, his tone casual, though there was something almost reluctant in his voice. "I'll get some supper going." Mary nodded and watched him retreat into the house. As she continued to clean, she thought about his words. There was something heavy in his voice, something that told her he carried a burden he couldn't quite shake. Bust. She didn't know what it was, but she sensed that one day he would tell her. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe that was just the way things were. People kept their secrets, their pasts, and moved forward, never looking back. As night fell and the stars began to twinkle in the vast dark sky, Mary settled into her new routine. Life on the ranch was hard, but it had its moments of peace. It was a quiet life, one that didn't ask too many questions and didn't demand too much of anyone, and in that Mary found a kind of solace she hadn't known she needed. The days passed, each one blending into the next as the seasons slowly changed. Mary's body grew stronger from the labor, her hands calloused but capable. She had come to understand the rhythm of the ranch, the way the animals needed to be cared for, the way the land could both nourish and challenge you. There was satisfaction in that, even if it wasn't glamorous. And all the while, Samuel remained a mystery to her. But for now, that was enough. She had her brother to care for and a roof over her head. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't have to worry about survival. And that, in itself, was a blessing. As the weeks passed on the ranch, Mary found herself settling into a new rhythm. The days were long, filled with hard work, but there was something comforting about it. The routine was simple, but it allowed her mind to rest from the worries that had plagued her before. Breaths. She had become accustomed to the early mornings and the long hours spent with Tommy, helping him with his chores and taking care of the animals. Samuel, too, seemed to adjust to the change. He was still the quiet, solitary man he had always been, but there was a softness to his demeanor that Mary hadn't noticed before. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Every day she would catch him glancing at her with an expression that was hard to read, sometimes kind, sometimes distant. She could feel his eyes on her when she worked with the horses or when she prepared their meals, but he never said anything. It was as if he was waiting for something to happen, or perhaps for something to change. Mary didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. There were moments when it seemed like he wanted to talk, to share something with her, but he would retreat into silence, just as quickly. She couldn't help but wonder about his past. What had made him so guarded? What had caused him to choose this lonely life, away from others, working the land with nothing but the animals for company? She had learned bits and pieces from the occasional stray comment, but nothing concrete. But in the quiet of the ranch, she had her own secrets. She knew that she had been running from something too. Her parents' sudden death, the pain of losing everything she had known, had driven her here, to this place. But Samuel had given her and Tommy a chance, but Mary knew that sooner or later they would have to leave. She couldn't stay forever. not without offering more than just hard work. Despair. She wasn't sure what more she could offer, but she knew that if she stayed, she would grow to depend on this life more and more. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. One afternoon, as Mary worked in the kitchen, preparing bread for their supper, Tommy came running into the house, his face flushed with excitement. "Mary! Mary!" he called out of breath. "There's a horse in the pasture! A new one! It's beautiful!" Mary looked up from her task, her heart racing. "A new one?" she repeated, wondering if Samuel had brought in another horse for the ranch. Tommy nodded eagerly. For strong. "Yes, it's big and strong, with a coat like brown leather. It's just standing there, like it's waiting for someone." Mary smiled, the thought of a new horse bringing a brief moment of happiness. She set the dough aside and walked out of the kitchen, Tommy trailing behind her. As they stepped out into the sunlight, they saw Samuel already in the pasture, standing next to the horse. The animal was magnificent, tall and proud, its coat a rich, deep brown, and its mane flowing like silk. It stood perfectly still, its dark eyes watching Samuel with an intensity that almost felt like it could see right through him. The rancher had his hand resting on its neck, speaking softly, as if coaxing it into trust. Mary walked up slowly, watching the scene with quiet awe. She had never seen Samuel like this, not with the horses. He was always efficient, always quick, but there was something in his posture now, something softer, more vulnerable. Perhaps the first time she saw a tenderness in his actions, something that spoke of a deep connection between man and beast. "He's been wandering the plains for days," Samuel said without turning to look at her, his voice low but steady. "I found him near the ridge this morning. He's a wild one, but I think he'll settle in here." Mary approached cautiously, her hand outstretched, wanting to see if the horse would trust her too. The animal turned its head slowly, its eyes meeting hers, and for a brief moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. She stepped closer, and to her surprise the horse lowered its head, allowing her to stroke its soft nose. Samuel watched her, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something like approval, maybe even pride. For a moment, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like a shared bond, a quiet understanding. Samuel said nothing, but Mary felt his gaze on her, warm and steady. "It's beautiful," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Yeah," Samuel replied, his voice carrying a rare note of warmth. "He'll make a good addition. We'll work with him over time. He's strong, but he's got a wild heart." Breath. Mary nodded, still focused on the horse. She didn't know what it was about that moment, but it felt significant. She had always loved animals, had been raised around them, but this horse, this wild creature seemed to be something more, and Samuel, his quiet words, his gentleness, reminded her that there was more to him than she had seen before. As the evening wore on, they went inside for supper, but the image of the horse stayed with her. There was something about the way Samuel had spoken about him, as if the horse's wild nature mirrored his own in some way. She couldn't help but wonder if Samuel was just as untamed, just as reluctant to trust, just as reluctant to be tamed. The next few days brought more work, more hours spent on the ranch. Mary and Tommy continued their chores, and Samuel worked alongside them, but always with a certain distance. Mary couldn't help but notice how he seemed to retreat even further into himself. There were moments when she would catch him staring at the horizon, his mind somewhere far away, and she wanted to ask him what he was thinking, but the words never came. And then, one evening after the sun had set and the stars began to dot the sky, Samuel finally spoke. "I didn't expect things to change like this," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I didn't expect you and Tommy to stay."
But I'm glad you did.
Mary didn't know what to say at first. She had thought about leaving many times, just packing up and moving on, finding somewhere else to go, somewhere she could build a life again. But something in her had begun to feel rooted here, something deep inside her that couldn't let go. "I'm glad too," she said finally, her voice soft. "But it's not easy, but it feels like we're part of something here." Samuel didn't reply immediately, but she could tell from the way he looked at her that he understood. For the first time, the distance between them felt smaller, less significant. Mary realized that, for better or worse, they were all bound together now. By the land, by their work, and by the quiet understanding that had begun to grow between them. And as the wind whispered through the trees and the stars blinked above them, Mary knew that something had shifted. She wasn't sure what it meant yet, but she felt it in her bones. A connection, a bond, a beginning. Life on the ranch had settled into a quiet routine that Mary had grown to appreciate. Though it was still far from easy, the work was never-ending, and each day seemed to stretch longer than the last. But there was a sense of purpose in it. Mary was no longer just surviving. She was building something. A life for herself and Tommy. She had begun to understand the rhythms of the land and the animals, and it was rewarding in a way she hadn't expected. But despite the steady flow of daily tasks, there was an undercurrent of tension between her and Samuel, a quiet hesitation that neither of them could ignore. It was clear that Samuel had grown accustomed to the presence of Mary and Tommy on the ranch, but there were moments when he seemed to retreat, becoming distant and withdrawn. Mary couldn't help but notice these times. Disappear for hours, disappearing into the hills or out in the fields, only returning once the sun had begun to set. She didn't mind the solitude, not at first. She had her own things to focus on, like caring for the animals and teaching Tommy more about life on the ranch, but the quiet stretches of time made her wonder about Samuel's past. Why did he prefer to be alone? What had happened to him that made him so guarded? One evening after a long day of working with the horses, Mary and Tommy sat together at the dinner table, their hands stained with dirt, but their faces tired and satisfied. Samuel had been unusually quiet that day, barely speaking beyond the necessary instructions. As they ate, Mary glanced at him, wondering if she should ask him about it, but she hesitated. There was still so much she didn't know about him, and she wasn't sure if he was ready to share. But Tommy, who had been unusually quiet all evening, finally spoke up. "Samuel, where do you go all the time?" "Why do you leave us here alone?" The question caught both of them off guard, and for a moment there was silence. Mary quickly looked at Samuel, waiting for his response. Tommy's innocent curiosity hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. Samuel set his fork down slowly and wiped his mouth with a napkin before answering, his voice soft but steady. "I go out to think," he said, his gaze fixed on his plate. "There's a lot of things I don't like to talk about."
Mary felt a pang in her chest.
She knew that everyone had their own struggles, their own pain, but hearing Samuel admit that he was carrying something so heavy made her wonder just how deep his hurt went. She wasn't sure what kind of response he was expecting, but she could tell that he wasn't looking for sympathy. He never had been. Breaths. Still, she couldn't help but ask. "Samuel, what happened to you?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He met her eyes then, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something, a vulnerability, before he quickly looked away. He seemed to struggle with the question, but finally he spoke again, his words slow and measured. "I was married once," he said, his voice low and almost as if he were talking to himself. "Pest. A long time ago, before I came here." But things didn't work out. Life, it didn't turn out how I thought it would. The weight of his words hung in the air. Mary didn't need to ask more. She could sense that the pain of the past was something he wasn't ready to revisit fully, but she could see it in his eyes, the sorrow, the regret. Samuel had lost something, someone that mattered deeply to him.
"I'm sorry," Mary said, feeling the sorrow in her own heart for him.
"You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. I wanted to know!" Samuel nodded once, as though acknowledging her understanding. "It's not something I talk about much," he said. "It's just easier to keep moving forward, you know? To bury it. But it's there. Always there."
Mary nodded, her mind racing with thoughts she didn't know how to express. She had heard stories like his before, of love lost, of pain endured, but hearing it from Samuel, a man she had come to respect, felt different.
He wasn't just a rancher to her now. He was someone with a past, someone who had suffered and kept going. It made her think of her own life, her own losses. What had she lost along the way? Tommy, sensing the change in the mood, quietly excused himself from the table and went to bed. Samuel and Mary sat there in the quiet, both lost in their thoughts. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside filled the room. Neither of them spoke for a long time, but the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was, for the first time in a long while, a shared silence.
"I didn't mean to bring up old wounds," Mary said after a while, her voice breaking the stillness.
"But I wanted you to know that.
We all have our things we carry. Samuel didn't answer right away.
Instead, he stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the land. "Sometimes it feels like the land itself is all I have left," he said, almost to himself. It's honest. It doesn't ask questions.
It doesn't expect anything from me. Mary didn't know what to say to that.
Psst. She had seen how much Samuel cared for the ranch, how much he had invested in it. It was his sanctuary, his escape.
"But it also felt like a prison at times. You don't have to keep everything to yourself," Mary said gently, standing up and walking toward him.
"You've got us now. We're here for you." Samuel turned to her then, and for the first time there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a glimmer of gratitude. "I know," he said quietly. "But I'm not used to depending on anyone. I don't know if I ever will be."
"That's okay," she said, her voice warm. "But you don't have to do everything alone. We're here, Samuel. And we're not going anywhere."
Samuel looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time, the wall he had built around himself seemed to crumble just a little. He didn't smile, but his gaze softened, and in that moment Mary felt a shift. There was a bond forming between them, slow and fragile, but real. The days that followed brought more work, more challenges, but something had changed. There was an unspoken understanding now, a quiet respect between Samuel and Mary. He no longer seemed as distant, and she felt the walls around him beginning to lower, little by little. But there was still something unspoken between them, something that neither was ready to confront just yet. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something, an understanding, a connection. And for now, that was enough. The days continued to pass. On the ranch, each one blending into the next. The seasons had started to shift, the warmth of summer giving way to the coolness of autumn.
The work on the ranch didn't slow down with the change in weather.
In fact, it seemed to intensify. The crops needed harvesting. The cattle needed care, and the land required constant attention. But through it all, Mary felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known in years. The hard work, though grueling, gave her something to hold on to. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about building something, about creating a life that was hers to shape. As the days passed, Mary's bond with Samuel and Tommy grew stronger. Breaths. Samuel, who had once been a solitary figure, seemed more open, more willing to share his time and space. He wasn't a man to show his emotions easily, but there was a shift in him. He wasn't as distant, and there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when he would speak more than just the bare minimum. He would tell her about the ranch, about how he had built it from the ground up, and about his dreams for the future. Those conversations, though brief, felt like windows into his soul. They made Mary feel like she was seeing the man beneath the hard exterior, the man who had lived a life of loneliness, but had never fully shut himself off from the world. For Tommy, the ranch had become his world. He had grown into the role of helping around the land, learning everything he could from Samuel. It was clear that Samuel had become a mentor to Tommy, teaching him the ways of the ranch, showing him how to work the land and care for the animals. Tommy's eyes had started to shine with a sense of purpose, just like his sister's. Oh, for the first time, Mary saw a light in his eyes that had been missing for so long. It was a quiet pride that grew in him as he learned more, a pride that came from knowing he was contributing to something larger than himself. Brace. One afternoon, as the leaves began to change color and the wind carried a crisp bite, Samuel stood in the barn inspecting the animals. Mary had been working with the horses, brushing their coats and tending to them. When she noticed Samuel's focused expression, there was a kind of intensity in the way he moved, a careful attention to detail that made her pause.
"Everything okay?" she asked, walking toward him.
Samuel looked up, his eyes softening when he saw her. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "Just thinking about the winter ahead. We'll need to get the barn ready and stock up on firewood. It'll be a long one, I think." Mary smiled and walked closer, her hands resting on the fence that separated them. "We've got it covered," she said, her voice filled with confidence. "We'll work together." "We've got each other." He looked at her for a long moment, as though searching her face for something. After a few seconds, he nodded slowly. "You're right. We're in this together." The words hung in the air between them. There was no turning back now. They had become a team, each relying on the other in ways they hadn't anticipated. Mary knew that she had found a place here, not just in the work, but in the lives of Samuel and Tommy. The ranch had become a home, a real home, something she had longed for without even realizing it. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its struggles, but it was theirs. As the days passed, the winter approached, bringing with it a sense of urgency. They worked harder, preparing for the colder months ahead. Wraths. Samuel had always been prepared for the harsh winters of the ranch, but this time he had help. Mary and Tommy, who were both eager to pitch in. Together they built up the woodpile, patched up the barn, and made sure the animals were well fed and secure. It was grueling work, but there was something about it that made Mary feel grounded, like this was exactly where she was meant to be. One evening, as the last of the day's light faded and the sky turned a deep shade of blue, the three of them sat around the small table in the cabin sharing a simple meal. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. It was a quiet moment, but it felt significant, like something had finally clicked into place.
"We've come a long way, Mary,"
said softly, looking at Samuel and Tommy. "When we first got here, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know if this was just another place to survive, or if it could be something more." Samuel glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't expect you to stay, you know," he said, his voice low. "But I'm glad you did. I'm glad we're here. Together." Mary smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I am too," she said. "We've made a good life here. It's not perfect, but it's ours." Tommy, who had been unusually quiet, looked up at them both. "I like it here," he said simply, his voice full of sincerity. "It feels like... Bert." At that, Mary felt something shift inside her. Buy a home. The word settled into her heart like a long-lost friend, and she realized that it was true. This ranch, with all its imperfections and challenges, had become their home. It wasn't just a place to survive anymore. It was a place where they could thrive, where they could build something together. As the days turned into weeks and the cold of winter set in, the ranch became a place of warmth and belonging. The snow fell gently on the ground, covering the earth in a soft, quiet blanket. Inside the cabin, the fire kept them warm, and the simple acts of daily life, working together, sharing meals, taking care of the land, became the foundation of something lasting. Mary had found her place here, with Samuel and Tommy. She had found a family, a purpose, and a future. And as she sat there, watching the flames dance in the hearth and listening to the wind whisper through the trees, she knew that this was only the beginning. They had come so far, but there was still so much more to build, so much more to discover together. And whatever the future held, she was ready for it. The ranch wasn't just a home anymore. It was their future, and it was everything they needed.